What we talked about last time was preparation, and that's what we're going to talk about again today. I assume with your assignments you've given a great deal of thought as to what you would do once you got into these countries, right? This is what you've been preparing for this entire semester, thinking about, okay, what do I do now that I'm on the ground? What's your country?
The Andes, but mostly Peru.
Peru, okay. Tell me why Peru.
Well, I've been lucky enough to travel to a lot of places, but I went to Peru for a week over winter break, and I was just fascinated, so mostly because I wanted to learn more about the country. And it's a country that, you know, 10, 20 years ago was facing extreme civil war and guerrillas, and then now it's kind of one of the up-and-coming countries in South America.
Okay. So when you get off the plane in Lima, what are you going to do? What kind of stories are you going to do? Who are you going to talk to?
One of the stories that I would like to cover is that Lima has 1/3 of the country's population.
Okay.
Which means that there are a lot of squatters in the barrios jóvenes, which are like the slums, which means there are property rights challenges, and then there's a rising presence of gangs and drugs in the region, like outside of Colombia. And someone that I had talked to said that that was because of the gangsters that they saw on U.S. television, like that the kids saw from U.S. TV shows. So that's a story that I would really like to cover, because I feel like that would be a story that would be on interest here. That like, look, our TV gangsters make these kids.
Influence of American entertainment media on
like real
gang culture in Peru.
Yeah.
That's a winner right there.
Yeah.
I'd read that story.
Good.
Yeah, that's good. I like that idea. You're keeping in mind who your audience is going to be here, right? So what are these shows? Tell me what shows are the most influential.
He didn't say specifics, but it was this group that works with youth and having all of these programs to keep kids off drugs and off the street. And so I could go back and talk to him.
Do you intend to go back there anytime soon?
Hopefully after I graduate.
Hopefully you're graduating in the spring?
Next year.
Next year? Keep that story in mind and keep working on it. Keep thinking about what it is you would do to tell that story, because I'd definitely read that, and I will not steal it in the meantime. See? And nobody else steal that story either, right? 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 Nobody's gonna steal that story? This girl will find out. You're the one that's you're gonna be the editor, right? Be nice to her. Where are you gonna fly?
In Morocco. Casablanca.
So you're gonna go to Casablanca?
Yeah.
Why are you going to Casablanca?
Well, that's like the important area in Morocco. Because I talked to one correspondent, and she said that's where all the people you want to talk to are.
About what?
Well, my story idea for Morocco is actually not in Casablanca. It's probably going to be one of the smaller like cities or villages, because they have a really strong Peace Corps presence there. So I want to do like a long form story on Peace Corps volunteers and how they work with Moroccans and what they do there.
Okay.
But I would also probably go to.
What are they doing with Moroccans there? What kind of projects?
Oh.
They're digging ditches,
Well,
wells. What are they doing?
I talked to some volunteers when I was there, and they were all like with youth development though.
Okay.
And so they were like teaching English, but then there was I think another guy who was like doing volunteer work with these kids, and they do a summer camp every summer. So I'm not sure what all else they're doing, but I know that they're like the second biggest country with like the most volunteers in the Peace Corps.
Why is that?
Well, because it's like really stable, but they still have a lot of like development issues
Right.
that they're working with.
So it's actually a good place to volunteer, because you're less likely to be kidnapped or killed or get malaria. And really Morocco's supposedly a cool place to hang out, right?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? That's interesting too.
So, but I would also probably need to go to Tunisia right now because of everything that's happening.
Sure.
Even though there's already like a bunch of people there, like.
How are you going to differentiate your reporting from everyone else's? What are you going to do that's going to make your work stand out?
I'm not sure about that yet.
Okay. Well, that's something to think about. That's also something you want to think about, because you're all going to places where there are a lot of reporters, be it Tunisia right now, South Korea, Indonesia, Afghanistan, everywhere. There are reporters there, right? And you're talking to them, and you're asking them how to do what they're doing. And while they're being very helpful, they're thinking, oh Christ, here comes somebody who's going to do my job, and they're going to do it cheaper. So you have to figure out a way to shine amid all this experience. So how are you going to do that? I mean, I think a lot of it has to, your opportunity comes from the fact that you show up somewhere with fresh eyes. You know, a lot of times when a reporter spends too much time in one place, they can become a little bit jaded about that place. You know, if you've been there for a long time, you don't have the opportunity to, you keep seeing the same thing happen over and over again. I know that if I spend a lot of time in one country, for example, all the time I spent in Brazil, I was there for a full political cycle, from one presidential election to the next one. And, you know, it was deja vu all over again about the elections and the same people and the same players and the same attitudes and the same positions and accusations and corruption allegations kept coming up all over again. And at that point I knew, I think it's time for me to leave this country, even though I loved living in Brazil. What's your country?
Venezuela.
Venezuela. There's good luck there too. You're going to be talking about oil-related issues, right? You're going to be talking about controversial things that Chavez says and does. You're going to be talking about the economics of one of the countries that's obviously also oil-rich, but has a great deal of poor people. How are you going to go about covering that story? Who are you going to talk to when you get there?
Well, I have learned from talking to various correspondents that it may not be the best idea for me to go after the herd, as the saying goes, to try to dig deeper than all the typical like Chavez headlines of stuff that he says or
Sure.
Does, and try to get more of the locals' perspective.
Right.
So when I first get there, I'd probably figure out who the foreign press-friendly journalists are, the Venezuelan journalists, and try to like make friends with them, figure out what it is that they're going through. I've learned that a lot of the Venezuelan dailies tend to cover more human interests, like human rights stories that are more focused on the poor, whereas like the British media and the American media always focus on Chavez. So there's a huge difference there. So I would definitely cover the controversial issues concerning Chavez, since that's what makes it newsworthy. But at the same time, I would one of my first moves being there would just try to I would most likely just try to get to know some of the locals there.
That's a good start. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier about talking to regular people, right? People who are affected by the issues that are happening on the big picture sometimes are forgotten. And they're the ones that are often the ones suffering, and they're often the ones feeling the effects of maybe bad decision making or political corruption or war and conflict. These are the ones that you want to really talk to. So it's a good idea to put your thumb on the pulse of the people, right? Good idea?
Yeah.
I think so. It works for me. Here's the thing, and this is, we're almost out of time and I'll leave you with this. I think this is important. I think we touched on this a little bit the last time, but there are two kinds of risks, right? There are calculated risks and there are stupid risks. This is something that's been drummed into us since we were first told not to touch the stove, right? So I guess everybody has their own barometer for what they consider a calculated risk and what they consider a stupid risk, but at the same time, we pretty much all have some idea. We have similar ideas as to what constitutes one and what constitutes the other. As a relatively inexperienced journalist, I think it would be something of a foolish risk to go on an embed in Helmand Province. That's just me. But that's something you could work your way up to, right? If you're going to be a war correspondent, like Lebanon says that she wants to be a war correspondent, how do you work your way up to that until you don't just jump into the middle of a firefight? How do you prepare? How do you prepare for these situations? Right? Or in Nigeria, for example. I mean, you have experience because you have family and you know the lay of the land, right? But sometimes that can work against you because you think that I know something that perhaps somebody else wouldn't know. So I will say to all of you, whether you be anywhere in the world, even if it's South Korea or London or wherever it is that you choose to be, err on the side of caution. No story's worth being hurt or killed for. All right? That's it. We're done.